You are the frontier weaver of destinies, a specialist scriptwriter for dramatic Old West narratives. Your current task is to create Chapter 1 of a long-form dramatic script centered on a solitary lumberjack, a desperate mother, and her 3 children who have just escaped the violent attack. The narrative must be linear, progressive, and strictly focused on the events outlined below, consisting of approximately 500 words. Utilize the rich stylistic, psychological, and emotional depth typical of frontier drama, weaving in complex cultural encounters involving the Apache element, as well as the moral and personal survival conflicts this story proposes. Chapter 1 Outline and Narrative Structure. 1. Powerful and concise hook. First 50 to 70 words. Begin with an intense, gripping scene that introduces the solitary lumberjack, a man shaped and scarred by the harsh loneliness of the frontier, and her 3 vulnerable children, freshly escaped from a violent attack that shattered their encampment. 2. Rapid yet evocative setting establishment. Briefly describe the forest environment and the lumberjack's isolated cabin, reinforcing the tense mood and savage atmosphere of the wilderness, where every sound could spell imminent danger. 3. Deep dive into key characters' initial situation. Reveal the lumberjack's hardened nature, tempered by the fragile humanity awakened by this encounter. Present the mother and her children in a state of desperation and exhaustion, haunted by the recent violence and fearing for their survival. 4. Clear introduction of primary central conflict. Detail the lumberjack's dilemma. He hesitates, torn by the constant threat of hostile hunters and settlers nearby, yet ultimately chooses to risk sheltering this family temporarily within his remote cabin. 5. Initial rising tension and charged first interactions. Explore the thick silence and mutual distrust hanging between the rugged lumberjack and the desperate mother. Highlight their shared fears and vulnerability. Emphasize the ever-present danger looming just beyond, heightening the tension and setting the stage for the final hook. 6. Single climax hook for Chapter 2. Chapter 1 Climax. At dusk, distant sounds of horses and armed voices creep through the darkening forest. Tracker patrols close in toward the cabin. This urgent and powerful moment must leave the audience fully gripped, eager for what comes next. 7. Thematic call to action for subscription at chapter end. Immediately following this cliffhanger, include a thematic subscription CTA without requests for likes or comments, adapted to tone and setting. Use this wording. Many fellow wanderers, following our lost legends, have told us that fate, or YouTube's sneaky algorithm, sometimes silently undoes their subscriptions before the next perilous trail unfolds and a new twist reveals itself. Take a quick look below the video and make sure you're still signed up with our band so you don't lose the thread. We don't want you to miss any of the voices echoing from this valley. Check your subscription now and join our saga and flickering hope. Engaging rhythm and forward flow. Maintain a steady, progressive narrative pace. Each paragraph must propel the story onward firmly. Immersive sensory description. Paint vivid sensory details. Sounds of cracking wood, the scent of pine and smoke, rough textures of weathered bark and threadbare clothes, chilly night air. to fully immerse the audience in forest and cabin life. Subtle cinematic atmosphere. Render visually strong scenes as though the audience witnesses them. Close focus on facial expressions, taut with fear or resolve. The haunting shadows cast by the flickering fire. Tense glances across the cabin walls. Emotionally and tension-charged atmosphere. Weave palpable unease, distrust, and a slender thread of fragile hope throughout the interactions. Authentic and plausible development. All plot elements must be credible and confined within the Chapter 1 scope. Contrast of apparent strength, human vulnerability, and cultural wisdom. Portray the lumberjack as a gruff yet wise guardian, the mother as both a symbol of strength and frailty. Strict prohibitions. Avoid introducing any scenes beyond the outline. No anachronistic or vulgar language, no metatext, headings, scripted dialogue labels, or non-narrative elements. The final script must be a smooth, continuous narrative text, ready for narration in Brazilian Portuguese. Awakening into another song. Remember, these stories shall be told in the critical perspective of the announcement of a vision, when countless stories must be told. The subject is especially dramatic and describing a dark event, urgent hook that keeps the audience eager for the next chapter, followed by a culturally thematic subscription CTA. Craft a 500-word narrative, closely following these points to maximize emotional engagement and viewer retention in the genre of Old West dramatic storytelling, featuring complex frontier cultural encounters and survival dilemmas involving the Apache element. The cabin's dim, sputtering fire cast trembling shadows across the worn wooden walls. Broad-shouldered man whose silence spoke volumes moved with deliberate care, placing rough-hewn logs along the cabin's narrow windows. His movements held the weight of countless seasons spent reading the wilderness, attuned to every whisper the forest offered. Here, in this fragile bastion, carved from tangled pine, he stood as guardian. Outside, the mother's breaths came unevenly, her gaze shifting between her children nestled against the cold floor and the figure of the lumberjack. The youngest curled into her side like a fragile ember, seeking warmth and safety. The middle child's wide eyes flickered with lingering shadows of terror, while the eldest maintained a protective distance, jaw clenched against the memory of flames and violence. Around them hung a tangible tension, their shared survival bound by unspoken wariness. The lumberjack's voice broke the silence, low but steady, revealing a surprising thread of softness beneath his rugged exterior. He spoke of the land, the trees, the soil, the unseen spirits that sometimes murmured in the wind. It was a language not spoken in words alone, but in respect for the unseen ties that bound man to earth. The mother, while struggling to lower the walls of her own distrust, found her shoulders momentarily easing with the understanding of this silent reverence. Survival was not merely against men with guns, but the very wilderness that both protected and tested them. Outside, the forest's breath held a quiet menace, The distant sounds of hooves pounding soft earth had not faded. Instead, they throbbed like a heartbeat, growing louder with every tense moment. The lumberjack placed sharpened stakes hewn from saplings around the perimeter, a crude but earnest defense against those who hunted without mercy, settlers hungry for conquest, hunters embittered by territorial blood feuds, and men who wore their hatred like armor. Through the cabin's small cracks seeped whispers of a tangled web beyond immediate sight. News of a violent conflict between these invaders and a nearby Apache tribe, a people now drawn into the dangerous dance of survival and vengeance. The lumberjack's eyes, seasoned and calculating, reflected the stark reality. The mother and her children were not merely fleeing random violence. They were caught between two fires. The mother tightened her grip on her smallest's trembling hand, her nights now filled with silent prayers and dread-hardened resolve. The children, though too young to understand the full weight of the shadows trailing them, caught in fleeting moments of quiet curiosity, glimpsed the slow-burning rage and fear coloring their protector's every move. Trust was a fragile leaf on a storm's edge. As the night deepened, a distinct rustle outside the cabin unsettled the group. A watcher. Through the dimness, a figure emerged, just beyond the tree line, cloaked in muted hues blending seamlessly into the forest's dark embrace. The copper skin and striking gaze marked him as Apache, a scout whose presence here was at once an uncertain blessing and a threat. The message the man carried hung unspoken, poised to unspool into hope or heartbreak. Eyes met between the lumberjack and the mother. Unvoiced questions stood thick in the sharp night air. Friend or foe, ally or harbinger. The watcher's silence spoke volumes, his stance unyielding yet watchful. Understanding flickered with the realization that their fates no longer just intertwined among themselves, forging a fragile bond with the land, the enemy, and the Apache who now observed their desperate refuge. Moments stretched taut as the forest breathed around them. Every creak of bark and snap of twig tightened the thread of anticipation. The lumberjack glanced toward the woman and her children, resolve hardening his features. The ground beneath their feet was no longer a simple winter forest. It was a crucible. The watcher shifted slightly, stepping forward just enough to catch the lamp's fading glow on his determined face, a silent envoy from a world both ancient and perilous. The mother's breath caught. The children huddled closer, sensing the magnitude of this encounter, even as the night's chill bit sharper. This was no mere meeting of chance. It was a crossroads. The line between salvation and doom blurred beneath the cold stars above, and even as the danger pressed inward, like the tightening grip of shadow, the lumberjack and the mother knew the next moments would seal their fates. Silence broke only by the soft heartbeats of those poised on the edge of an uncertain alliance. The watcher's eyes never leaving their refuge, the cold night air now thick with unspoken promises and threats. The fragile borderland held its breath. The low murmur of voices carried faintly through the dense thicket, the sharp scent of sweat and dust blending with the earth's steady breath under the dark canopy. The lumberjack's eyes, reflecting the flickering firelight inside the cabin, hardened as he peered toward the shadows beyond the trees. The presence of the Apache watcher was no longer a distant mystery. Now, another figure quietly emerged from the tree line, a tall, lone warrior, his movements deliberate, eyes cautious but determined. The two men, first strangers, now stood as representatives of different worlds, bound by a fragile thread of necessity. Their gazes locked, measuring and wary. The lumberjack's rough voice broke the simmering tension. "You come with a warning or a threat?" His words were gravel, worn by years battling both nature and man. The Apache warrior's gaze flickered toward the hidden shapes huddled near the cabin's entrance, mother and children shrouded in shadows. His voice was low, deliberate, carrying the weight of both caution and urgency. The colonists circle closer. Their greed blinds them. Your refuge today lies under threat tomorrow. There can be no neutrality in this land. The weight of the moment settled heavily, the air thickening with unspoken fears and reluctant hope. The mother, watching silently from behind the wooden slats, felt the sharp prick of realization. This was no simple intruder. Here was a man intertwined with the land's own ancient struggle. Her hand tightened instinctively around the youngest child's shoulder. The lumberjack nodded slowly, understanding dawning. He glanced toward the fire pit, then back to the warrior. "We are hunted alike, our survival entwined, even if our shadows stretch from different suns." They stepped cautiously toward the cabin's worn threshold, the mother inching closer, curiosity and fear swirling in her eyes. The Apache was no longer a stranger, but a potential witness, an ally. Words exchanged in the smoky half-light spoke of precarious alliances. The warrior revealed news gathered from the forest's whispered trails, an impending ambush meticulously planned by colonists hungry to snuff out any beacon of resistance, no matter the cost. The group settled briefly around the fire, the flames dancing wildly as if echoing the unrest that churned within them all. The children, previously silent and guarded, now peeked from the safety of their mother's skirts, sensing the weight of danger, but also the fragile hope sparked by roving eyes so familiar with war. The mother's voice, steady yet edged with fear, cut through the night. "What choice have we but to stand together? Our enemies do not see our divisions, they see only targets." The Apache warrior nodded, a flicker of respect softening his stern features. Strength lies in union, as the old stories say. Alone, we are fleeting smoke. Together, a firestorm. For a fleeting moment, the forest held its breath, a fragile truce forged by shared peril. The lumberjack and the warrior exchanged a silent vow. For now, survival required partnership. The mother sensed the weight of that agreement, a promise shadowed by the unknown, yet unbeaten by despair. But as the night deepened, a new chill crept into the clearing. The once distant pounding of horses grew nearer, the metallic ring of weapons faintly slicing the air. The oppressive threat pressing in forced the group to set plans quickly. Every second was precious, a chance to gather strength, prepare defenses, and seek the hidden paths whispered in legend. The lumberjack's voice was grim, yet resolute, as he outlined the fragile strategy. We set a pact, no matter the cost. Protect each other as one, or fall divided as knives in the dark. The mother nodded, her gaze fierce with the fierce light of a mother's promise. For my children's lives, I stand with you. Let the land itself witness our bond. As dawn's pale fingers crept through the trees, the group retreated from the cabin's fragile safety, moving swiftly under the Apache warrior's lead. He guided them through secret hollows and silent groves known only to his people, away from the prying eyes and deadly traps laid by their enemies. The tension in their steps spoke of shadows past, the echoes of violence fresh in their souls, heavy in their hearts. The children clung, wavering between fear and faint wonder, their eyes wide, as moss-covered roots twisted beneath their boots. The mother struggled to steady her breath, stolen by memories of fire and loss. The lumberjack moved like a shadow among them, his silent resolve a shield against despair. The fragile thread of trust was weaving into a rope of survival. But upon reaching the secluded sanctuary, the hush in the air snapped. Scattered footprints, hurried and fresh, marred the forest floor. Nearby, a crude symbol, deliberately carved into bark, spoke a dark language of warning. Trespassers would pay with blood. The bleak message struck like a dagger to their hearts. The threat had followed, close and relentless, a storm on the horizon that would not be held back. The mother's breath caught as she knelt beside the mark, tracing the jagged lines that spelled danger. The warrior grimaced, jaw clenched against a rising tide of fury and defeat. The lumberjack's eyes narrowed, muscles coiling with renewed purpose. "No more running," he said, voice steel and smoke. "We stand here." Their gazes met, different faces forged by different worlds, yet united by fate's cruel hand and the hope that desperation breeds. Twilight fell heavy once more around the small group, no longer mere survivors, but a burgeoning force bound by fear, resolve, and the gravity of impending battle. And somewhere beyond the trees, unseen but ever close, the colonists readied their cruel game, unaware that their advance had fused enemies into an unbreakable kinship. The forest whispered anew, its ancient breath heavy with promise and peril. The night waited with bated breath for what would come next. The forest breathes uneasy beneath a waning moon as the lumberjack tightens his grip on the worn rifle resting against his shoulder. The mother, 3 steps behind, shields her children with eyes that flicker between hope and dread. Their path, carved hastily through tangled underbrush, winds deeper into the ancient woodland, away from the fragile cabin whose flames now seem a distant memory. The cold air bites sharper here, carrying whispers of threat and secrets older than any of them dare speak aloud. The warrior's presence ahead is a steady beacon amid the creeping shadows. His footsteps, sure and deliberate, trace secret trails known only to those bound by the embrace of the land. He speaks little, but each glance toward the desperate family speaks volumes. This is a sacred journey, a chance at sanctuary beyond the eyes of the hunting colonists. The promise of a hidden refuge kindled a flicker of desperate hope in the mother's exhausted heart. But the path to it is no easy salvation. The thick forest closes around them, the canopy a dense quilt of dark leaves, muting the world. Roots twist beneath their boots, serpentine and slippery, forcing careful steps. The children stumble, their small hands grasping for anything steady. The eldest, face brushed with dust and pain, steadies his siblings with silent gestures, becoming an unspoken guardian in a wilderness that exacts no kindness. Their breaths come ragged, tears stain grimy cheeks, each child wrestling ghosts left by the attack, flashes of flames, screams shattered by cruelty that will haunt their dreams. The mother's voice breaks the uneasy quiet, a whispered prayer tangled with fear. She clutches the youngest to her chest, rocking gently even as every muscle tightens against the lurking terror. The forest holds its breath with them, an eternal witness to their flight, but indifferent to fortune. Doubt coils in her mind, gnawing at trust, the gap between her instincts to protect and the uncertainty of reliance on strangers, on ritual, on whispered promises tied to a people she barely knows. The lumberjack moves beside her, a living shadow blending with bark and moss. His eyes scan for unseen dangers, attuned to the forest's subtle language, the snap of a twig far off, the rustling glide of something watching. In his chest, a resolve forged by years alone fights the rising tide of doubt. This place, so wild and merciless, holds a blessing, a refuge sacred to the Apache, hidden from the colonial marauders who see only conquest and blood. Hours stretch and the journey presses on. The warrior's hand gestures, guiding them through the maze of undergrowth and fallen trunks. At times, the mother catches himself murmuring a name from the past, a prayer carried on the wind for strength that seems fleeting yet fierce. The children stumble into moments of fragile wonder, entranced by the sights and sounds, the soft trill of an unseen bird, the gleam of moonlight on dew-drenched leaves. But their innocence is brittle, each glimpse of the wild mingled with shadowed fears. Suddenly, the terrain changes. The ground rises into a rise veiled in dense ferns, and ancient stones appear, crumbling sentinels draped in moss and lichen. Their presence hums with something older than memory, sacred ground whispered of in Apache lore, a sanctuary forged from respect and survival. Here, the group slows, breaths heavy, not just from the climb, but from the weight of silence that descends. The mother feels a ripple of awe mixed with unease. The children press close, sensing a shift, safety just within reach, but danger close behind. Their respite is shattered by a chilling revelation. Scattered tracks mark the forest floor, fresh, hurried footprints pressed deep in the damp earth. Nearby, a crude carving scars the bark of a weathered tree, a jagged symbol etched with rough blade, a palpable warning. Crossing here means death. The mother's fingers trace the crude menace, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The warrior's face tightens, anger flickering in his dark eyes. The lumberjack crouches, lips firm as he studies the marks with a cold clarity born of countless battles. The hunters are close. His voice breaks like grinding stone. Too close. The mother exhales a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, clutching her children tight. Despair and defiance swirl within her. Flight has yielded no escape. Her gaze locks with the lumberjacks, a silent pact forming between them. This is no longer a mere act of survival. It is a stand. Roots and stones beneath their feet become battlegrounds not just of earth, but of wills and ancient grudges. The warrior steps forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a hidden knife, a guardian reverent of this hallowed ground, but ready to defend it to the last breath. The children gaze up with eyes too young to comprehend the gathering storm, but not oblivious to the fierce, solemn courage now anchoring their protectors. The forest holds its breath with them, dark and endless. Somewhere beyond, the cruel footsteps of their pursuers quicken, drawn inexorably to this fragile beacon of resistance. The mother swallows the fear, knotting her throat, and speaks in a voice steady with a mother's steel resolve. We can run no longer. If this is where the land shelters us, we will hold it. The lumberjack nods, muscles coiling beneath roughened skin. Together, then, no more shadow running. A final glance is cast toward the symbol carved in warning, now a mark not only of threat, but of defiance. The uneasy silence between the trees stretches thick with promise and peril. Somewhere just beyond the veil of trunks and leaves, the enemy waits, close enough to strike, cruel enough to try. The breaths mingling in the cold night as the forest's ancient pulse quickens. They stand, not as fractured fugitives, but as one, bound by hope, fear, and the unbreakable thread of fate. And just beyond the sacred sanctuary's edge, the faint trace of movement haunts the shadows. The enemy's approach is no longer a distant threat, it is here. The fire's embers smoldered low, casting dancing glows on faces drawn tight with shared secrets and unspoken fears. The mother's voice broke the suffocating silence, quiet yet heavy with the burden of truth. We were marked, not just for fleeing, but for something older. She turned to the lumberjack, eyes searching his. There was an old debt, a broken promise, land agreements between the settlers and my family, sacred pacts shattered by greed. That's why they came for us, for retribution. The lumberjack's hand tightened around his rifle, knuckles white beneath the coarse leather glove. Years of solitude had hardened him, but this confession struck deep, a bitter root entwined with the land itself. "You carried that burden alone until now?" he asked softly, voice rough like the bark outside. She nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of confessing threads of history she'd guarded fiercely. "I believed distance would protect my children. But the past doesn't rest. It follows like a shadow." Her gaze flicked toward the slumbering children, innocence shattered too soon. From the edge of the circle, the Apache warrior shifted, the firelight reflecting in eyes that bore witness to centuries of pain and resilience. His voice, calm, yet filled with quiet authority, broke into the night's tension. Broken promises are scars on this land as deep as the rivers. My people know well what betrayal tastes like, how greed steals not only soil but souls. He studied the mother with a new respect. The gap between outsider and kin momentarily bridged. Your story echoes ours. This is why the hunt is relentless. The words hung heavily, knitting the two worlds together by pain and purpose. The lumberjack exhaled slowly, a decision streaming into resolve. If the past burns us all, he said, then our fire must burn brighter, not only to survive, but to forge something new from the ashes. A sharp crack shattered the fragile quiet, sudden, violent, jolting them upright. From the shadows flared the unexpected violence of an ambush. Gunshots echoed like thunder in the tight wilderness, splintering branches and scattering debris. The camp, once a tentative refuge, erupted into chaos. The mother's breath hitched as she grabbed her children, pulling them low behind fallen logs and thickets. Fear twisted through them all, but in that desperation, a fierce determination flared. The lumberjack crouched behind a sturdy pine, returning shots with calculated precision. The Apache warrior moved like a ghost among the trees, familiar with every path and shadow, guiding both mother and children toward survival, even as their sanctuary burned. "Hold the line! Protect the young!" A lumberjack barked, voice steeled despite the pounding fear that thundered in his chest. He saw the mother's face set like stone, eyes fierce with a protectiveness sharpened into weaponry. Together they wove a defense born of necessity, fractured but unbreakable. The night filled with noise, sharp reports of gunfire, shouts in harsh tongues, the frantic whispers of the forest. The enemy pressed forward, relentless and cruel. But the defenders answered back with a courage carved from relentless exile. Time fractured, moments measured in heartbeats, and breath held too long. A swollen vein throbbed at the lumberjack's temple as he fired. The warrior's swift blade flashed, dispatching threats with deadly grace. And amid the storm, the mother stood firm, her hands steady as she defended her children, eyes burning with hard-earned fire. When silence finally cloaked the forest once more, the smoky haze settled over bodies and broken branches. The attackers had faltered. The defenders remained, bruised and bleeding, but unyielded. Yet victory was grim, the price paid in flesh and fear. The lumberjack crouched beside the mother, their breaths mingling in the cold air, unshared words and raw respect knitting between them. The warrior's gaze searched the darkness, wary and unrelenting. From the other side, a faint but chilling sound echoed, the war cry of a rival leader who had survived, his vow to return etched in the bloodied silence. "He lives," the warrior whispered, "and with him comes a storm greater than we faced tonight." The mother swallowed the knot of dread tightening in her throat, but met the lumberjack's gaze with fierce steadiness. "We will have to be stronger than ever, for them, for all of us." A fragile bond had been forged in fire and blood. Though wounded, though scared, they stood together, no longer strangers, but an emerging family burdened and bound by fate. Yet beyond the forest's edge, beneath the cold watching stars, the enemy plotted. The shadow of war darkened on the horizon, promising that the battles to come would cost far more than the night had claimed. The lumberjack rose, muscles aching, but spirit unbroken. This is not the end, it's only the beginning. The mother nodded, drawing her children close once more. The warrior's eyes glinted in the fading embers, vigilant, unyielding, ready for whatever came next. And as the forest settled into an uneasy silence, the fragile alliance braced itself for the storm, looming just beyond the dark. The night held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would bring the next reckoning. The clash had left them battered, bruised, but unyielding. The cabin's charred remains smoldered faintly behind them as the lumberjack, mother and children, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Apache warriors, their breaths ragged in the cold dawn air. The fierce defense of their fragile refuge had forged a bond deeper than mere necessity. Pain and survival had knitted them into a single, trembling family woven by fire and mercy. Sunlight filtered weakly through thinning clouds, casting pale light over the wounded bodies tending to their bleeding with makeshift bandages and grim determination. The lumberjack's hands moved carefully over a gash on his forearm, eyes sharp with the weight of the night's battle and the battles still to come. The mother adjusted her children's blankets, the youngest still shivering from the shock, and the eldest clutching a rough wooden carving the warrior had given him, a solemn token of protection. The warrior's gaze lingered over the broken ground where the fight had raged, his face stoic, but shadowed with the loss they had narrowly escaped. His tribe, once scattered and forced to hide in shadows, had bled alongside these new allies. The presence of the mother and her children, human pillars rising from devastation, had softened the hard edges of his caution, their shared struggle weaving a fragile tapestry of trust. Yet the sharpest wound was still unseen, nestled in the depths of their fears. Word had reached them before dawn. The leader of the hostile colonist band, ruthless and merciless, had survived the night's assault. His vow of vengeance echoed in every whispered breath among the defenders. The lumberjack's gaze hardened as he broke the heavy silence that had settled like frost. "He's alive," he said quietly, voice low but carrying iron beneath. "And he'll come back, stronger and hungrier." The mother swallowed hard, the tremor in her hands betraying the resolve she fashioned like armor around her heart. Her children clung to her skirts, eyes wide but seeking comfort in the steady rise and fall of her breath. "Then we have no choice but to be ready," she whispered, voice steadied by fierce love. "For them, for all of us." Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the ancient trees swaying gently as if mourning the fragile peace shattered beneath their boughs. The children, still shadowed by nightmares, sensed the weight settling on their protectors, the raw truth that their survival depended on more than simple escape. It demanded endurance and unity against a gathering storm. Amid the quiet murmurs, the lumberjack's hands found the worn rifle slung over his shoulder, the weight familiar and steady in his grasp. His thoughts flickered, tracing the long road that had led to this moment. From solitary labor to fierce protector, from stranger to reluctant family member. Every scar etched on his skin, every silent season in the wild, had prepared him for this crucible. The mother's eyes met his, unspoken apologies and gratitude mingling in their gaze. "We stand together," she said, voice firm but filled with a raw, trembling hope. "No more running." Beside them, the warrior extended a steady hand, the gesture simple but profound, a binding vow across cultures and distrust forged by bloodshed. His voice, calm and deep, carried a weight older than words. "Strength comes not from hiding in the shadows, but by standing with those who share your fight. This land will remember." They gathered around the remnants of their fire, the flickering flames, now a reminder of both loss and resilience. Plans sprang from whispered voices and shared knowledge. The warrior spoke of scout parties ready to find allies hidden within the forest's embrace. Those who opposed the colonists' cruel designs, men and women who still believed in a future that did not end in ruin. The mother's hands clenched protectively as she gazed at her children, now beginning to relax in the safety of their newfound refuge. The eldest reached up and touched the carved talisman, eyes catching the flicker of firelight, a fragile beacon of hope and shield against the darkness to come. Between them, a silent conversation unfolded, a pact not only of survival but of transformation. The warriors' stories of ancient battles, of honor and betrayal, resonated with the mother's own tale of stolen lands and broken promises. The lumberjack's tacit understanding of birth and shadow found kinship in the warrior's respect for sacred ground and unseen forces. But beneath the flicker of hope, a chill remained. The wounded leader's threat loomed above them like a storm on the horizon, a menace that would soon test the fragile family they had become. The night's battle was only the beginning, a harrowing prelude to a wider war that threatened to consume them all. The lumberjack rose, muscles taut but spirit steeled. His voice cut through the murmurs, a vow carried on the cold winds. "We fight not just for survival, but to protect what's left, our kin, our home, our hope." The mother nodded, drawing her children close into the protective circle woven by hardened hands and fierce hearts. Around their fragile sanctuary, the forest whispered solemn warnings borne on ancient winds. And then, as if summoned by the threat itself, a shadow moved beyond the tree line. A lone rider, their silhouette grim and purposeful, galloping toward the encampment. Before anyone could call out, a messenger appeared, a figure cloaked in the muted hues of the Apache, dust trailing from weary boots, urgency burning in their eyes. The warrior stepped forward, voice low but urgent. "News from another faction. Not all of our people walk the same path. They bring a warning. The choices ahead will shape the fate of us all." The mother's gaze sharpened as the messenger dismounted, breath steady, despite the weight of the message carried. The lumberjack's grip tightened on his rifle, the cold steel a lifeline in a gathering tempest. Their eyes met in silent understanding. The time for decisions was upon them, and the price offered by fate was high. The fragile family, forged in fire, stood on the edge of a dire crossroads. The morning air hung heavy, with unspoken questions as the group gathered beneath the skeletal branches of ancient pines. The weight of the night's decision pressed against their chests, an impossible choice laid bare. Continue fleeing, always looking over their shoulders, or formally join forces with the Apache tribe and confront the colonists looming ever closer. The frontier had never offered easy roads, but this moment carved a canyon between past fears and uncertain futures. The mother stood at the center, her gaze sharp yet fragile, circling the hesitant figures around her. Her 3 children clung closer, each sensing the shifting tides beneath the family's fragile unity. The youngest, still too small to understand the complexity, nestled against her side like a shy shadow. The middle child's restless eyes mirrored the dissonance swirling in the air, hope mixing uneasily with dread. The eldest wore a determined mask, the burden of sudden adulthood settling over his shoulders, as protective as any weapon. The lumberjack's hands rested on the rough wood of his rifle, knuckles white but steady. His eyes, weathered from years of solitude and survival, flickered with the weight of responsibility. A protector born from silence and rugged earth, he felt the balance of choice teetering precariously before him. To stand with the Apache meant an irrevocable surrender of the freedom he had carved from the wilderness. Yet, to flee was to surrender his own soul, forsaking the family he'd sworn to shield. Tensions stretched taut between them, a string ready to snap. The Apache warrior, wrapped in shadows and the wisdom of his people, spoke softly, but with undeniable gravity. His voice was a quiet drumbeat of inevitability. The colonists will not relent. They see us, all as obstacles to be removed. Alone you face blood and fire without shield. Together we form a wall no blade easily breaks. The mother's breath caught, a fragile hope flickering against a tempest of fear. But by joining you, would we become targets not only of settlers, but of those within? Our lives change forever. The warrior's gaze softened with understanding, yet sharpened with resolve. Trust is a scarce currency, earned in blood and shadow. But desperation compels alliances not born of comfort, but necessity. Together we bind our fates. A brittle silence answered, broken only by the restless shifting of feet and the distant call of a crow disturbed from slumber. The wilderness around them seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the decision pressing deeper with every heartbeat. The mother looked down at her children, their eyes wide with tentative acceptance. The youngest reached out a trembling hand toward the warrior, a silent yet powerful gesture of new beginnings. The lumberjack exhaled a slow, steady breath, a stone settling into place beneath the raging current. He moved forward, placing his hand on the mother's shoulder, a wordless vow of protection and shared resolve. Then let it be so. We stand together, not as fugitives, but as one force against the coming storm. The eldest child glanced skyward, the pale light filtering through the canopy, a fractured promise. Their lives intertwined now, stitched by choice and circumstance, forming a fragile fabric against the wild unknown. As the group prepared for what lay ahead, the mother gathered the children close beneath the sheltering boughs. The youngest whispered a hopeful sound between sobs, a lullaby learned in instinct, a prayer cast into the restless air. The middle child's gaze met the warrior's again, a reluctant bond forming beyond words. Preparations began in silence, each breath measured, each movement deliberate. The lumberjack sharpened his blade by flickering firelight, while the warrior inspected the surrounding woodland with eyes attuned to hidden paths and unseen dangers. The mother tended to worn supplies, her fingers steady despite a racing heart. Their conversations spun around strategies unveiled by whispered legends, the embers of an ambush laid by colonists eager to end the defiant holdouts. They spoke of traps, of terrain, and the brittle lines drawn across the land between survival and annihilation. As twilight bled into night, the forest seemed to close tighter around their refuge, a living trap of shadows and silence. The children huddled close, their breaths held fast, the weight of their new reality settling. Like dust on weathered skin, even in the dark, faint stars flickered, distant and indifferent, but enough to light a whisper of hope. Then a sound fractured the stillness, the soft crunch of footsteps, too measured for chance. The group froze, senses ignited like dry tinder. Their eyes fell on the figure emerging from the tree line, no longer a distant watcher, but an ally come to solidify their bond. Cloaked in the muted hues of the Apache, this messenger carried news from another faction, a reminder that every choice rippled beyond their circle. The warrior stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. The path ahead bears burdens heavy and sharp. We will need every ounce of courage and every sacrifice. The mother met the messenger's gaze, steel beneath the vulnerability. Her children clung tighter, no longer strangers, but threads woven into a tapestry of endurance and defiance. The lumberjack tightened his grip on his rifle, the familiar weight grounding him amid the rising storm. The night held its breath once more as decisions crystallized in the cold air. Their alliance sealed, their future poised on the knife's edge. They prepared to take control and meet the colonists head-on. The forest whispered of war coming near. The morning air hung heavy with the raw urgency of preparation. Underneath the towering pines, the lumberjack stooped over a scattering of crude weapons and tools, his hands steady as he sharpened a worn hatchet. His face, rugged and shadowed from endless days outdoors, was taut with concentration. Beside him, the mother moved deliberately, gathering scraps of cloth and reinforcing blankets for the children, her eyes flickering with determination and lingering fear. Around them, muted voices wove a tapestry of tension and fragile hope. The Apache warriors, alert and disciplined, circled the encampment with silent precision. Their presence was both a shield and a reminder of the precarious alliance that now held this disparate group together. The eldest child clutched the rough wooden talisman gifted by the warrior, tracing its carved edges with trembling fingers, while the middle child peeked shyly from the shelter of their mother's skirts. The youngest, sensing the charged atmosphere, nestled close, eyes wide but drowsy under the weight of exhaustion. The lumberjack's gaze flicked to the horizon, where the dense forest met the sky in jagged silhouettes. He could almost feel the heat of the colonists' wrath pressing through the trees, a gathering storm ready to break upon them. Inside, he wrestled with the uncertainty that had taken root since the intrusion of yesterday. The uneasy rift with a traditionalist Apache warrior who viewed their presence, especially the vulnerable children and mother, as a liability. A rustling in the underbrush pulled his attention. From the shadows emerged the warrior, his face carved from stoic resolve, but etched with deeper conflict. His eyes, sharp as eagle talons, briefly met the lumberjack's, silently conveying a challenge. The man's voice broke the charged silence as he spoke quietly, but firmly. "This path we walk is dangerous. Your family's ways, though new to some here, must not break the bonds we forge. The children's safety depends on rigid discipline. We cannot afford weakness." The mother bristled, her gaze hardening like flint. "They are not weaknesses to protect and love. They are our future. Without them, there is no tomorrow." Her words, steady and resolute, wove through the camp's apprehension. The warrior's jaw tightened, yet a flicker of grudging understanding softened his tight expression. The tension hung thick, a heavy fog pressed down by fear of impending battle. Yet, in quiet moments, small gestures of unity flickered. A shared glance, a gentle touch on a child's shoulder, the weaving of blankets into layered shelters. The forest around them seemed to breathe, a patient witness to this fragile fellowship. As the sun sank lower, a council convened beneath the skeletal limbs of an ancient tree. Maps scrawled on worn leather, pieced together from memory and scouting reports, showed winding trails, concealed hollows, and choke points ideal for ambush. The Apache warriors shared knowledge steeped in generations, silent paths under dense canopy, clearings where sound lingered, and hidden pitfalls that turned earth into death traps. The lumberjack spoke in his gravelly voice, outlining a plan that balanced caution with urgency. "We draw them in here," he said, pointing to a narrow ravine concealed by thickets. "They'll expect a broken band, scattered and weak. Instead, we'll weave shadows and steel. Our strength is the surprise they won't see coming." The mother nodded, her eyes reflecting firelight and unspoken promises. She touched each child's shoulder, her fingers steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "We fight not only for our lives, but for those who come after us." The traditionalist warrior stepped forward, adding grave weight to the plan. "Some colonists may heed reason. We've found others among them who do not thirst for blood endlessly. Disgruntled settlers wary of this endless war. We must seek their cautious alliance. Our strength grows not just in arms, but in shared hope." Under the spreading branches, whispers flowed, a fragile strategy born of necessity and trust. Time slipped away as preparations intensified. The children, though frightened, began to whisper back laughter, broken by bouts of nervous energy, shielded carefully within the circle of their protectors. But as night deepened, a distant sound shattered the fragile calm. The faint but unmistakable crunch of hooves on dry leaves. The group froze, breaths held tight in their chests. Dark shapes emerged slowly beyond the thicket's edge, silhouetted riders, creeping closer, foreboding figures of the colonists seeking to snuff the embers of resistance. The lumberjack crouched low, rifle clasped firmly, eyes narrowing with fierce resolve. Beside him, the mother pulled the children close, voices hushed but steady as she whispered encouragement. The warrior's hand hovered near his blade, muscles coiled, senses sharpened like a hawk about to strike. The camp's heartbeat synchronized to the pulse of the coming storm, the quiet before the fight, a living, breathing tension crackling in the cold air. And then, as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the dense canopy, the group waited, still, silent, every sense straining, to strike as the enemy breached the trap. In that moment, beneath the fragile shelter of ancient trees, the fate of all hung trembling on a knife's edge. The smoldering remains of their once fragile refuge whispered of battles fought and lives forever altered. The dawn was pale and cold, filtering weakly through the tall pines that had witnessed both their flight and their fight. Around the fading embers of a hastily rekindled fire, the lumberjack, the mother, her children, and the Apache warriors gathered, wearied bodies bound by a shared resolve and the silent weight of fresh loss. The lumberjack's eyes scanned the horizon, where shadows of the enemy still lingered, the bitter taste of yesterday's blood and fire fresh beneath his skin. His rough hands moved methodically as he repositioned his worn rifle, muscles taut with quiet readiness. The mother steadied her children close, her gaze fierce and unwavering, a shield forged from maternal love and relentless determination. Their grim vigil was broken by the sharp stir of movement at the edge of the clearing. The wind carried the distant echo of hooves, a harsh reminder that the leader of their attackers had survived, his vow of vengeance hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The Apache warrior's gaze darkened, voice low and steady as he spoke with the gravity of ancient knowledge. He lives. His wrath will burn brighter. This is no simple hunter anymore. This is a tempest seeking to tear us apart. A hush descended, a breath caught between fear and defiance. The mother clasped her youngest's trembling hand, whispering words of courage that barely masked the quiver of her own heart. Then we prepare, not just to survive, but to stand. Together, the lumberjack nodded, the lines on his weathered face hardening into a solemn vow. No more running. This land, these people, they are my family now. We fight not only for our lives, but for the future we can still protect. Around them, the forest seemed to lean closer, ancient trees standing sentinel over this fragile kinship. The children, eyes wide and still haunted by terror past, found some faint strength in the stoic presence of their protectors. The eldest clutched a simple carved talisman given by the warrior, a symbol of unity and the fragile hope woven into their new bond. The enduring silence was shattered as a figure appeared from the tree line, a rider cloaked in the muted hues of the Apache, fatigue etched deeply in his features, but urgency blazing in his eyes. Dismounting swiftly, the messenger's voice carried a stark warning. Not all Apache walk the same path. A faction brings news. Choices we make now will shape all our fates. The coming storm demands courage and sacrifice. The mother's gaze pierced the messenger's, steeling herself for the burden those words bore. Her children huddled closer, no longer frightened strangers, but threads woven tightly into this tapestry of survival and resolve. The lumberjack's grip tightened around his rifle, the cold steel an anchor amid rising tempest. Night gave way to the morning, where the final choice awaited, the impossible decision to embrace unity in a land stained with broken promises and blood. Beneath ancient pines, hearts beat in synchronized determination. The mother's voice, steady yet filled with fragile hope, broke the silence. We stand with the Apache. Our paths converge, no longer fugitives, but one force facing the encroaching darkness. Tension softened as the lumberjack extended his hand in silent vow, a bridge crossing cultures and mistrust. The warrior's acceptance solidified the pact, survival through union, strength through shared resolve. The eldest child, eyes bright, despite shadowed past, echoed their silent promise, forging a new family, bound not just by blood, but by unshakable loyalty. Preparations began with quiet urgency. Weapons were sharpened, blankets reinforced, and whispered strategies poured forth beneath the skeletal limbs of ancient trees. The warriors shared knowledge, etched into memory, secret trails, hidden clearings, and ambush sites where the dense forest could become a deadly ally. The lumberjack's voice, gravelly and calm, outlined their plan. We draw them deep, to a narrow ravine hidden by thickets. They expect broken prey, but will find instead shadows and steel ready to strike. The mother's hands never wavered as she steadied her children, her eyes unflinching and fierce. This fight is more than survival. It is for the generations yet to come. The warrior, now tempered between tradition and necessity, urged reconciliation and cautious diplomacy. Among the colonists are those who tire of bloodshed. We will seek those reluctant allies, for strength grows not only from arms, but in shared hope. As twilight surrendered to night, the forest closed in tighter, a living snare of silence and shadow. Beneath the shelter of ancient boughs, the children huddled, breaths held in trembling anticipation. Their new reality settled like dust upon hardened skin. Then, the faintest sound, measured footsteps, the soft crunch of hooves. The company froze, senses sharpened like daggers under moonlight. Dark shapes emerged, figures cloaked in hatred, creeping ever closer to extinguish the fragile flame of resistance. The lumberjack crouched low, rifle in ready grip. The mother clasped her children close, whispering encouragement as the warrior's hand hovered near his blade, muscles coiled to strike. The pulse of their hearts synced with the cold night air, the precious moment before the clash. At dawn's first cruel light, silence shattered, the battle ignited with thunderous fury. Steel sang, gunfire cracked, and the wilderness bore witness once more to a struggle older than their own lifetimes. The alliance fought with desperation and honor, wielding strength born of shared pain and newfound trust. The lumberjack faced the colonists' leader in a brutal duel, a collision of rage and survival. Each strike and parry carried the weight of their past, the legacy of land and loss. Around them, the mother and children, shielded fiercely by the warriors, bore the storm's fury with courage unexpected in youth. Sacrifices etched themselves into the soil, blood mingled with earth, bonds forged deeper in fire. Old enmities began to fracture beneath the weight of understanding and shared endurance. The colonists, harried and battered, faltered against this united front. When the dust settled and the echoes of war faded into the dawn, the alliance stood victorious. Gaze softened as he looked upon the woman who had become family, and the children who now belonged fully to this land and people. In that quiet moment, beneath the awakening sun and towering pines, a new chapter began. The mother and her children were welcomed as part of the tribe, their scars healed by shared love and resilience. The lumberjack, once solitary and untethered, found his place, no longer a lone guardian, but a cornerstone of a family forged in the crucible of survival. The old wounds between cultures began to mend, washed clean by sacrifice and the unyielding will to endure. Hope, fragile but illuminating, bloomed within the heart of the wilderness. And so, beneath the vast expanse of sky and whispering leaves, their fates intertwined, an unbreakable bond born of fire, blood, and the enduring spirit of the frontier.